George Washington was more than just the first president of the United States or a great leader of our country. He was so great and is so remembered that his home is one of the most visited places in Washington, D.C. George Washington created his famous Mount Vernon estate while leading our country in its early years, and Americans have treasured it ever since then. Although George Washington is most famous for being leader of the Revolution and the father of our country, one of the biggest projects of his life was creating his dream home, Mount Vernon. George Washington lived at Mount Vernon from 1747 until he died in 1799. Washington studied architecture and garden design books to plan the design of Mount Vernon. Washington spent 40 years after the French and Indian War expanding and remodeling Mount Vernon. George Washington's self-built mansion was 8,000 acres. George Washington's half-brother, Lawrence Washington, built the house in 1743. Washington used a painting style called faux graining to make many rooms in the house look like they were made from high-end mahogany. Washington spent his whole adult life constructing Mount Vernon, and to a degree it is a simulacrum of his own complex and ever-evolving personality. Washington's personal library had up to 1,000 titles by the time of his death. Two of Martha's grandchildren lived with him during Washington's presidency. Under George Washington's watchful eye, his family's 8-room house was transformed into a 21-room mansion. Mount Vernon sits above the Potomac River, and it is just 11 miles away from D.C.'s Reagan National Airport. From 1774 to 1788, George Washington was doing important work for our country, but also seeing a major remodeling and expansion of Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was named for Admiral Edward Lawrence, commander in the British Navy. The second part of the rebuilding started in the spring of 1774. The second rebuilding added north and south wings to Mount Vernon. He wasn't present during most of the expansion, but he hired a local builder to supervise the remodel. Not only the mansion, but the whole estate, such as the stables, slave quarters, storehouses, kitchens, and coach houses, were always being expanded and repaired. In 1787, a weather vane in the shape of a dove with an olive branch in its beak was put on the spire of the cupola. It symbolized peace for the nation. The expansion of Mount Vernon was completed in 1788. The large dining room is the biggest room in the mansion. The large dining room made up the entire north wing of the house. An oversized Venetian window in the large dining room shows a view of Mount Vernon's landscape. The south wing gave the home a private study to the first floor and Washington's bedchamber to the second floor. One of the plantation's most intriguing structures was a 2-story treading barn. Washington had hundreds of slaves. Most of the slaves were field hands, carpenters, and housewrights. The cupola was the most important addition to Mount Vernon. Its job was to keep the inside cool in the summer. Thanks to the work of many dedicated people, Mount Vernon is now a popular attraction that closely resembles the property as it looked during George Washington's life. Mount Vernon slowly became run down by the mid-1800s. Anne Pamela Cunningham encouraged women to help repair the estate for historical reasons. She started her fundraising with the ladies in the South and then expanded to the North. About 150 years ago, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union purchased the estate and land for $18,000 from Washington's great-grandnephew, John Augustine Washington III. In 1860, during the Civil War, both sides of the war valued Mount Vernon because the North saw Washington as the country's great unifier and the South saw him as one of their own rebels. Cunningham stated that Mount Vernon would be neutral territory during the war. For the last 150 years, tourists who visited Mount Vernon have seen things like the gardens that didn't really look the way they did when Washington lived there. The layout of the garden today is the 7th version since Washington has lived there. There are 2 remarkable gardens. One is for growing fruits and vegetables, and one is for ornamental flowers. 6 years ago, gardeners began trying to restore the garden to its original state. Gardeners have realized that the recently planted shrubs during renovations were not the kind Washington had when he lived there. Esther White, an archaeologist who led a group of people working on the garden, was able to discover in the soil what was originally planted in the gardens during Washington's time. Archaeologists were able to use Washington's diaries, writings, visitors' accounts, 18th century gardening books, and gardeners' weekly reports to get the garden back to the way it was in 1799. One theater within Mount Vernon lets visitors experience the fighting with the British with fake fog and snow, while the sounds of cannon shake the floor. a detailed sculpture of a sick soldier coughs and sneezes in his Valley Forge camp. At Mount Vernon today, visitors can see 3 life-size models of George Washington. The life-size models are of Washington as a 19-year-old surveyor, as the 45-year-old commander-in-chief in the Continental Army, and as the 57-year-old first president. On the first floor, the large dining room, front parlor, little parlor, central passage, downstairs bedchamber, and small dining room and study are all open to the public. On the second floor, the Lafayette bedchamber, Washington bedchamber, and the Nellie Custis bedchamber are all open to the public. On the third floor, Mrs. Washington's bedchamber and the cupola are all open to the public. Visitors are not allowed to visit the bedroom in which Washington died in. A replica of Washington's original weather vane is on top of the cupola today. This month, a duplicate slave cabin, like the one that was home to Washington's slaves Slam, Joe, and Scylla, and their 6 children, will open. The replicated slave house is one final touch on the $100 million effort to add to Mount Vernon. The original Dove of Peace weather vane, made by architect Joseph Rakestraw, is kept in Mount Vernon's Donald W. Reynolds Museum. George Washington sleeps with his fathers today in a brick tomb built to his specifications on a wooden slope between the mansion and the river. Now you can see a major part of George Washington's life beyond the Revolutionary War and his presidency was creating his dream home of Mount Vernon. Thanks to the work of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and many historians, Mount Vernon today looks much like it did during Washington's life. A visit to Mount Vernon will help you better understand the life of our first president on a more personal